This meeting is being recorded.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. Welcome to the June 2019 episode of Shaping EDU Live. My name is Samantha Becker, and I'm coming to you live from the University Technology Office at Arizona State University. Today, we're going to talk about data, because as of today, everyone is talking about data. We're collecting more of it, yes. We're connecting it to broader strokes of student success and engagement, yes. We're certainly sharing more of it, yes. We're training and hiring more data scientists, yes. But are we doing it right? According to a subset of the many similar recent headlines floating out there, no, we may not be. So I want to just go ahead and share a brief slide of some of the recent headlines in papers and articles floating out there about data and the use of student data as a primer for this conversation. And as I'm doing that, I'm just going to remind everyone, if you are not speaking, just to go ahead and mute yourselves to eliminate any stray noises. Otherwise, I will mute you with the utmost love and compassion. All right. So, we know that also the GDPR has further complicated matters for education institutions around data compliance. But I think we might be getting better at making some progress, especially thanks to expertise from folks like the one serving on our panel here today. So here today to talk about the challenges, opportunities, and the dream of truly advancing student success with data is a distinguished panel of data and EDU experts. But before we meet them, just a few more logistical notes. I promise to keep them brief. While the Zoom chat is available for free-flowing discussions, we also encourage you to tweet along with the hashtag #ShapingEDU. The conversations can and will continue past the hour, and we invite you to chime in either on Twitter or in the official Shaping EDU Slack workspace. If you are not in the workspace yet, you can learn about it and request access from our homepage, shapingedu.asu.edu. And once again, for those that have just newly joined the room, as a practical matter, I ask that everyone in the audience please keep themselves muted unless speaking. That said, if you have a question at any point, feel free to raise your hand or ask your question directly in the chat. Our wonderful and talented graphic facilitator, Karina Branson of ConverSketch, had a conflict today, so she'll be producing artwork that reflects today's conversation after she views the recording. For those perennial Shaping EDU Live participants, you know that Karina is usually here live sketching the conversation. So we'll look forward to the art that she produces after our conversation. Okay, time to dive in. I'm joined today by several panelists who all have great perspectives to share for taking data strategies to the next level in education and the obstacles we must surmount along the way. Several of them also have various examples and readings that we'll be sharing in the chat. And so at this point, I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves and your connection to the subject. So first up, Colleen.
Good morning from Tacoma, Washington. My name is Colleen Carmian. I'm the AVC for Academic Innovation at University of Washington, Tacoma. That becomes half-time in August because I am also the founder of Ethical Analytics, a consulting firm supporting higher ed in implementing analytics. The end.
Welcome, welcome, Colleen. So glad that you're here. Over to you, Jenna. And you are on mute.
How about now?
All good.
Okay, I'm Jenna Olson. I am in charge of learning analytics at Western Governors University. We're a very large, relatively new, and entirely online school. And it's my job to go through and find all the data I can about who our students are, what background they're coming with, what they're doing, and how it's working for them.
Thanks for joining us today. Over to you, Dave.
Good day, everyone. My name is Dave Kill, and I'm working at Civitas as what I call a data geek. So I love processing any type of data. But for the past, I would say, decade or so, I've been really focusing on building the last mile in data science, machine learning. What that means is that okay, you build a bunch of predictive models. Now, what do you do with all these predictive models and, let's say, derive student features to create student success outcomes? So I've been working on building that bridge.
Thanks so much for joining us here today, Dave. I just want to check in. There appears to be some audience members having audio issues. I just want to confirm that everything is good on others' ends. Okay. Just drop a note in the chat either way. Excellent. Over to you, Tanya.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tanya Houston. I'm the Director of Digital Learning Research and Development and also the National Research Center for Distance Education and Tech Advancements, which we like to call the Data Research Center, which is funded by the U.S. Department of Ed, FIPSI, and the Spencer Foundation. And so we have worked for the last 5 years when we've developed this initiative to identify key factors that influence student outcomes with post-secondary institutions across the country. And so really excited to be here today.
Thank you so much for joining us, Tanya. And certainly last but not least, a fellow colleague from the University Technology Office at ASU, Mike Sharkey. How's it going?
Very good, Sam. Hey, folks. Mike Sharkey here. I am in lovely Scottsdale, Arizona, here at ASU. I am an analytics consultant at Arizona State. I'm the president of my analytics company, Data and Graphs. I've been doing analytics and data in higher ed for over 15 years. I've been on the university side. I've been on the vendor side. I've had my own predictive analytics company. I focus a lot in LMS data and how we can extract valuable information out of LMS data and other learning tools so that we can help students succeed. And the thing that I appreciate the most is collaboration. I worked years ago on a collaborative analytics project, the PAR framework and WCET, and the fact that working with colleagues all trying to solve the same problems, I love having those conversations and having sessions like these. So very much looking forward to a fun hour. Thanks for having me, Sam.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you all panelists, and now we're ready to dive into our discussion. At first, we really need to sort of better introduce the problem and opportunity. So just to kind of set the stage a little bit, Tanya, I'm going to ask you, in your view, how do you see data currently being used in education? What are some of the ways in which you are observing it being used?
Yeah, I guess in thinking about how data was used, I'm first thinking about what sort of questions are driving our research. I think a lot of times we think about data because we have so much, of it because our technology systems, but I think we really need to think about nationally what are the sort of questions we're asking. And because of the fact we have so much data, I think we have a lot that we're thinking about the student behaviors that we can track through data and how that can help us better understand students. I personally think, though, there's a lot of room for us to have more questions that help us improve instructional and institutional practices, course design, instruction, instructional support services, faculty development, student support services. And also, too, there's multiple approaches. I know we have data scientists here on this panel, but beyond that, there's still a lot of research that's being conducted and funded by the Institute of Educational Sciences at the U.S. Department of Ed that follows experimental design. We conduct that as well, along with a lot of descriptive survey research. And so I think there's a lot of room to advance our methodologies to improve learning and success. And there's lots of areas in an institution that we can improve beyond just understanding student behavior. And I know other folks will talk about that.
Thank you so much for sharing, Tanya. Jenna, I'd love to hear you respond to this from a data scientist perspective.
Yeah, thank you. I think a lot of the institutional data just goes straight to reporting that has to be done by institutions at all levels. And it's a very post-mortem sort of use of the data. You're reporting on things that have already happened and not really trying to affect any changes moving forward. And so that's one of the main uses I see. And then the other one is a decision-making process around what students we let in and how we treat them and where we put them. And I think that's definitely a place where we could be using the data so much better.
Thank you so much for sharing, Jenna. And so that kind of leads me to a next question about making sure that we're actually getting the meaningful data and figuring out the right things to measure so we can make those connections. So I'm going to toss it over to you, Colleen. How do you actually figure out what to measure and how to extract and get meaningful data on which to base such decisions?
That's a great question that I think is answered only by many people in an institution, right? It starts looking at the data you have, that the data that, you know, as Jenna said, has always been used by IR for postmortem reporting, but could be used in real time to help our students get to the finish line. And that means that a lot of data that has historically been kept in silos, that many departments don't want to give up, has to be opened up to a bigger multivariate view so that we can see who needs help at this time, and then how do we give the permission to the right people so that they can help those students.
Thank you, Colleen. And I want to kick the same question over to you, audience. Talk to me about the ways in which you believe that your institution is collecting meaningful data. You know, what kinds of data are being collected. We'd love to hear your personal stories and anecdotes about what's working well and what's not working well. And I'm going to ask the same thing to Dave, too, for his perspective.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me better?
You sound great.
Okay, great. So from my perspective, I think what's going to be important for decision making is that we need to understand what is working for which students when delivered under what modality and in what situations. I really call that sort of and I know that Tanya, you talked about experimental design, and then Jenna and Colleen, you guys talked about postmortem data analysis. So what I'm really trying to understand is how do we identify, let's say, prescriptive student success opportunities in real time based on live data. And then we have to have some what I call impact prediction engines. So the idea is that you need to be able to understand which kinds of interventions delivered under what situation, through what modality, will produce the greatest impact on student success. So you can actually start thinking about how to put all these things together to help live students. And that decision-making, that kind of decision-making comes from the knowledge of what is working for which groups of students under what situations. And that's really what we need to be emphasizing more in terms of going beyond just the data-driven predictive modeling.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dave. Speaking of going beyond that model, I want to kick it over to Mike to talk to me about genuine measures of student success, because I feel like so much of the conversation gravitates towards like what is truly a measure of student success. It is something that is elusive and hard to measure, as the broad term student success and student engagement that we're constantly hearing those terms are hard to define themselves because they're so broad. So Mike, what are some genuine measures of student success that you could point us to?
So there's a couple, but it really depends on what you're doing. So if I'm looking at data about a math tool in a math class, that's pretty narrowly focused. I can look at something like how many students are passing that class. It's not everything, there are weaknesses in that, but because it's close and narrowly scoped, I can do that. If I get real broad and say retention, right, always comes into play, there are so many things that play into that it can become a bit of a white whale. You're starting to chase it, how we measure retention, did what we do actually impact it, and then you spend all your cycles arguing the metric as opposed to actually doing things that'll help happen. So one thing I would argue is if it's something that's more, if you're doing a project that's more narrow in scope, then feel free to measure and something that's appropriate at that level. Did they pass the class? Grades, outcomes in the course. As you get more and more broad, like retention, graduation, it's really hard to sort of bet the farm on we want to do this and move retention by this many points. Start looking at alternate measures like usage and satisfaction. We'll give something to a team, a coach, and say, does having these data make you a better advisor in your role? And I'd much rather impact that metric Does someone feel they can do more of the data, as opposed to trying to impact, 0.2 percentage points of retention over the next year, because you just end up arguing about the metric as opposed to having results.
So I think what you're getting at is serving the human capacity, and I plus one to that.
I always say use data to complement human decision making, not to replace it.
Amen. Amen. I'm going to float the same question to you, Tanya, to talk to us about genuine measures.
Yeah, it's funny because Marilyn had just posted in the chat about some work they were doing, and I was like, what data did they use? I think, again, it goes back to sort of what Mike was just saying and so forth, is what sort of decisions or questions are we looking to answer to improve practice, and then what measures are going to help us do that. And obviously, I think I've said on lots of podiums and harped about collectively identifying and capturing meaningful measures. And I think one of my big criticisms is that we have a lot of data science happening that isn't informed by learning theory or social theory. So for example, if you think of the way that people define engagement and the measures that they use based on the technology, the data that's in the technology or the data warehouses to define engagement, actually has nothing to do with the theory of engagement. And so I think we need to work together to look at how theory-informed meaningful measures in the data and these technology platforms can be better derived. And I also think, and I know it was already talked about in the chat, I think Mike and some others, the triangulation of data is super important. So maybe we can't measure engagement with just how much they touch the technology, but maybe we're incorporating data from the SIS system, a survey, the tech platform, maybe we're also collecting some qualitative data. I think mixed methods approaches are great. So, but I think right now we're doing a really poor job of defining and gathering meaningful measures, and we're throwing out great PR words that actually don't mean anything in the analysis. Sorry.
No apologies necessary. In fact, I'd like to stick with you for just a second, because as we're talking about some of the major challenges and, in the PR realization, if I could call that something, I'd like to talk about strategies and tactics for moving and transitioning to better ways of making data-driven decisions. You and some others have mentioned collaboration, and this is a collective process between stakeholders, but any other concrete strategies and tactics I think will really help us understand how to transition to a better way.
Yeah, well, some of the things we've been doing is collectively working with institutions across the country to identify, Sam, the questions that we want to be answered. So for example, in our work particularly is dealing more with online learning. We do some blended and some other tech enhanced and competency-based education too. But our decisions are, for example, how should we be designing online courses? And it's not just about anecdote or descriptive research. We're actually trying to link different quality indicators of online courses to student outcomes to know which ones are the most meaningful and we should be paying attention to. We're doing the same thing in better understanding online learning readiness. We've spent 20 years developing instruments to understand student readiness for online, but yet we have not done a great job of understanding predictive validity and what characteristics actually influence student outcomes in the courses. So together we need to think about, what are the big questions that we need. I used to run a faculty development center. I used to oversee the LMS and instructional improvement. And I just, I wanted more solid empirical data to make decisions. And I think collectively we need to, come up with those questions and answer them together, not just within our institution.
Well said. This is not an institutional issue. This is a higher ed, education, life and society issue. So thank you, thank you. And there's a lively chat happening about, the measures question and this talk about how do we move to action. So Dave, I'm going to kick this one over to you because I see we got an amen from you there. How could we actually move to a better way? How do we get to the action part?
Yeah, I think everything starts from understanding which prescriptive success opportunities actually will produce the level of impact that you're expecting. So the idea is really understanding that, hey, there are all kinds of different impact levels, starting with academic, non-academic, financial aid, and so on and so forth. it boils down to understanding which of those levers will move the needle on student success the most. And we call that elasticity measures. So just like in economics, we're talking about price elasticity of demand. In this case, student success elasticity impact levers. So once you understand which of those levers will have the greatest impact on student success, the next one is really intentional intervention design. And at the same time, you need to understand that you have a portfolio of student success programs. Do you know which of those programs are working for which subset of student population by how much? So this is where, data science can really come into play. And I love the fact that a lot of times when you're building these student success models, you have to have the right success metrics, and that needs to be informed by subject matter experts in learning theories and student engagement and behavioral science folks. So once you have all these multiple models, you really have to understand which of the programs are working. And after that, it becomes a resource allocation problem. So the question is, how can you basically leverage all this knowledge to funnel students to the programs where they're likely to benefit the most? And I think that's really the key, in that sometimes there are key social psychological blockers. So we need to understand how to leverage behavioral science to really address those blockers, and then help them understand that, hey, there are these support programs that they can leverage to excel in their performance and do it in a sort of a voluntary and pleasant way for these students.
Okay, no, this is great advice. Okay, so say that vision is realized and there is sharing of the data between units, schools, institutions, students, faculties, staff. We still need to think a lot about the ethical implications and considerations. Could you give us some insights on what such ethical considerations for sharing between units, schools, et cetera, might be?
So in my case, I come from the healthcare background. And I always said you have to use data in a responsible way to improve patient health outcomes. And I say the same thing for students, in that as long as you use the data in a meaningful way to improve their, let's say, performance and let's say even job performance, I think that's really the right use of data. But if you're using data for doing some, let's say, unimportant things, is just gathering information for the sake of gathering information, hoping that it'll be useful someday, I don't think that's really what needs to be done. So the idea is that everything has to be intentional. When you're collecting data, when you're using data to make real-time decisions to help improve student success outcomes, you have to have a clear understanding of how the whole thing becomes intentional with the goal of improving student success outcomes. So we are trying to do good for students, and the data has to support that kind of processes that we are all trying to implement as part of a responsible citizens.
I appreciate your mention of responsible citizens, because I do think that's a really valuable and important point to make here. I want to ask you, Jenna, as we're talking about data sharing, and as we talk about the sharing that takes place between units, between and beyond institutions, I'm curious, Jenna, your approach and thoughts on how do we bridge data silos that are now emerging or that have emerged?
For me, one of the things that's helped the most with that is going into the process with some definite questions. Reasons that we need, like financial aid information or student transcript information to see where they were before they came here and what classes they took. Having a way to show mutual advantage to both sides of that silo has really helped to kind of maybe not break them down entirely, but start to build like pipelines between them to be sharing, to receive that data and then be sharing the results we get from it, so that we can show like the enrollment team what students are doing after they get here, or the financial aid team, what behaviors are closing the Pell Gap. Things like that within the institution, being able to show how a free flow of data will help all of the different teams. As far as like between us and vendors or publishers, it's a really similar thing. A lot of the the publishers we work with, like Pearson and McGraw-Hill and others, they want to be able to show that their resources are effective and that they're helpful. So it's, again, having that mutual advantage really helps.
Thank you, Jenna. I know, Tanya, you have a different, you're viewing this from a different vantage point as a head of a national research center, for collecting data. What are your approaches and advice for how institutions and others can break down the silos that often emerge with data?
Yeah, I think all of us on this panel are coming from different approaches to some degree. So I think the diversity is great in the research that they're conducting and what levels they're conducting it and so forth. For us, we actually worked off of the work from Power Framework and from iPads and others to build data code books to help facilitate data sharing across institutions. But where we aren't just looking at doing institutional data, we are collecting attitudinal data and self-reported behavioral data through surveys as well. One of the big things, I've talked with, I don't even know, like dozens of institutions across the country who all really want to, or members of the institution that really want to participate. And there tends to be always that one data steward that's like, absolutely not, for whatever reason, we can't share our data. Even anonymous, we can't share our data. Even though you're federally funded through the US Department of Education, we can't share your data. And we've created a couple tools in the data research toolkit, which Laura posted in the chat, that actually has a data sharing agreement, which I've used with institutions. So we've had a few institutions on board. I saw research, but I think that that's one of the problems, is that we have this misunderstanding of data sharing, federal regulation for data sharing. And it would be nice if we had some efforts to clarify national policies or federal policies around data sharing. There's also a misunderstanding of FERPA. And so that would be another great area. I know institutionally I've been very lucky because of my position and closeness to the provost to be able to have access to all the data. And I agree with all of you talking about financial data is really great. Total sarcasm. But what we were able to do, we really needed to know, we look at underrepresented students as well, and we really needed to gather the Pell Grant eligibility piece, which we ended up being able to do. But I just think there's a lot of misunderstanding about data sharing, and until we start having clarification at the federal level about the policies, we're going to continue to have data stewards that are resistant to share data. And you know what? It's at the detriment of the student and of higher education.
Thank you so much. And I think the federal perspective and the changes that need to occur are really important to address. But in lieu of that actually happening today or tomorrow, Colleen, I'd like to ask you how individual institutions can set up effective processes for capturing, analyzing, and securely sharing data.
You know, we are at the stage where sharing data for some of us is less important than understanding how our students are unique. As institutions carve out spaces for themselves, whether they're R1s or privates or for-profits, not-for-profits, private, our students are different. And, you know, for UW-Tacoma, our students are so diverse, and, you know, we're urban serving, access oriented. So it was really important for us to understand them. And to the question of incorporating their needs into what we were starting to do, I had a student research assistant that did a study asking our students what they needed to know regarding how we were using their data and what we were going to do with their data. For instance, we got incredible pushback on using our Canvas data as part of our analytics. They were okay with demographics, they were okay with Pell eligibility, they were okay with all sorts of questions that we were trying to look at to see who needs support services or who we were not serving at the moment. But they were very concerned about instructors being able to see their engagement in the LMS and what that always going to happen with that. And so if we are going to come up with ways of individually as a campus with unique needs moving forward, then we have to stay focused on being transparent, on keeping the data in the right hands, and on what we're attempting to do with student success. You know, we can't keep allowing students to pay ever increasing costs and then leave the institution with nothing, right? That it's almost sinful and irresponsible. So our work in analytics is to keep the students informed, of course, but to move forward. And to move forward, I'm going to go back to that keeping in the right hands. So many custodians of data in higher ed are not people trained to be responsible with the data in terms of interactions with the students. So once you move the data insights to action, you have to be really careful about who sees that data, who uses that data, who reaches out to students. You know, having a registrar send a notice of please don't leave without filling out the form for dropping out to students who are struggling is not a responsible act. It causes students to drop out, right? So how do we create a new profession within higher ed that knows how to be responsible with the data? I mean, that's the bottom line, right? We either have to train our custodians or the people we're now allowed to see the data, or we have to find a new office, a new place to put moving insight to action.
Thank you so much, Colleen. And before we kind of shift gears in our conversation subject matter a little bit, I'm going to ask the same question to Mike. I know you have some perspectives on, some actionable perspectives on securely sharing data.
The part of sharing that I like, I mentioned earlier, is collaboration. You know, there's so much of us, many of us here on this call have just done a lot of the heavy lifting work. Jenna and I had a conversation in San Diego a month ago, and it's like, yep, did that, that kind of like, you know, camaraderie thing. But I've shared code with people. I've had conversations on the phone with people. I've shared architecture diagrams. We're all trying to solve the same problems. And when you start sharing the heavy lifting, just the bland data janitorial work, it just takes that off the table. It's not going to solve all your problems. There's no one place to go. There's learning analytics, Google groups, and there's IMS, and there's lots of different channels. So it's not like it's a single place, but everyone, many of the people here are in the same kind of threads and forums, and just ask. And most people, at least that I've noticed, said, yeah, I'd love to. Let's chat. You know, I'll give you some pseudocode. I'll let you know what I did. And that kind of takes a lot of the heavy lifting off there. So don't forget collaboration as part of that.
Thank you so much, Mike. That's a fantastic point. Being inclusive of stakeholder voices in the whole process is extremely important. And speaking of stakeholders, I know we invited a bunch of students to attend the Shaping EDU Live and other Shaping EDU Lives. I have to ask, any students in the audience here with us today? Okay, well, hopefully they'll be joining us next time. And just one thing to keep in mind, there are students in our Slack workspace for Shaping EDU, and it's always wonderful to get their perspectives. And as we're talking about stakeholder input, Jenna, I'd like to ask you to think about how institutions can think about or provide greater student agency in terms of seeing and using the data. Oh, no problem.
How about now?
All good.
Okay, I think there's some good opportunities there, and being able to show students what their data is being used for and what can be gained from it, I think really helps around the whole discussion that's been going on in the chat about how much should students know about their data being used, and like the example of taking x-rays without their knowledge, and being able to look at things like that. One of the things we've started to work on doing is building like analytical views that students can see of what's going on, and things like how much they're engaging with something compared to their peers. Not by name, of course, but in terms of like, here's how much you're engaging compared to other active duty military students who passed this course. Or you're spending this much time on this section, and the most helpful thing for you to do at this point would be to do these exercises or this reading. It's that same idea of making it something that's beneficial to them, and setting them up for success as well. And kind of like Colleen, I think, mentioned, you know, you have to be really careful what messages you're sending to students, and not be sending them something when they're struggling that says, oh, and when you decide to drop out, do it this way. But to instead be sending them messages that are like, students like you who were working on this section got the best like ROI on their study time from engaging in this behavior.
So Jenna, I want to chime in to accentuate what you said, in that when we did impact analysis on, let's say, institutions sending transactional messages to students based on alerts, we actually found negative impact, because you are really hitting them with transactional messages when they're down. And I don't think that's the right approach. You really need to think carefully about how to use the right type of nudging behavior science techniques to really help students when they are most vulnerable.
I completely agree. One of the things we've been deliberately avoiding is transactional nudges like that. It's turned into more of a like a student-facing homepage, where it's not a push notification where we're pushing out nudges and saying, hey, you should do this, but it's more of a homepage they can go to and see, okay, what does my activity look like? What things do I have coming up? And, you know, here's this ranked list of where I would get the most benefit from the 30 minutes I have available today.
Any of the other panelists want to chime in about student agency and students' exposure to the data before we move on? Okay, moving right along. So we talked a little bit about genuine measures of student success, but there's also something else to talk about, which is genuine measures of student struggle. I believe the concept of micro interventions were brought up either in conversation or in chat. So Jenna and Dave, I know you have some thoughts on this. What are some genuine measures of student struggle that require micro or other types of interventions? And how do we create a networking effect of students helping students? Because that's not necessarily something we visited about yet. First, we'll go over to you, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, this is a topic of great interest to me, because I used to work on similar projects in the healthcare space under the fundings by NIH and NSF. So the idea is how to spread good health behaviors through a social network with sensor data. So the idea is, how do you know if a person is struggling? And we usually focus on changes from their routine behaviors, and then how they respond to, let's say, material events, such as adverse events. They just did poorly on a midterm exam, or let's say, and we did a lot of NLP analysis on the types of messages that faculty, let's say, send to students. And some of the messages are very discouraging, I mean, based on what I've seen. So we are trying to better understand how students respond to, let's say, different events or different stimuli, and are their responses different from what we used to see. And let's say we have some of the opportunities in terms of, okay, this, you know, these students used to register only for their upcoming terms, but for this term, for whatever reasons, they're not really registering, and it's really late into the current term. So we always focus on changes in students' activities and behavior, especially in relation to their peers, to better understand number one, are they struggling? And number two, if they are struggling, what might be the underlying reasons? And in that case, it may not be a bad idea to ask relevant question or two through microsurveys to really get a good picture of why students are struggling and what can be done about it.
Thank you so much, Dave. Jenna, your thoughts?
Yeah, so one of the things I've been working on a lot is to move our awareness of student struggle away from like high stakes failures like tests or final papers or things like that, and to become aware of it sooner. I really like what Dave said about changes in the student behavior. I also, some of the other things that we've been using as indicators of struggle are what we call pathological rereading, where it might not be reading, it might be other activities, but they're doing the same thing over and over and over again. And that repetitive behavior is one of the indicators we use that the student might be struggling with that concept or that section, because they keep revisiting it and repeating the same behaviors. Another one that we use is a comparison between the time and like the active engagement that the student is in a specific section and the time and active engagement that it took their peers to complete that section. So if we have a student who's they're not doing that pathological rereading, they're moving through things, but it's taking them 5 or 6 times as long as their peers to get through the same section, then that's another one of the flags that we surface to like the faculty, the instructors and advisors as an indicator that this looks like the student's struggling, because their normal behavior, going off of what Dave said, their normal behavior is close enough to their peers, but on this section, they're taking many times as long as their peers to make it through the same content. So it might be time for like faculty intervention before they get to something like a midterm or a final exam, and that failure becomes more of a psychological blow.
Thank you, Jenna. I feel like that's a great example, and I think it will be good to bring some more concreteness to the subject. So I know that some of you, including Mike, you're up, have some actual exemplars of data-driven practices, effective data-driven practices to share. So Mike, take it away.
Great, thanks, Sam. Yeah, always happy to share because I think it helps when people see actual use cases. I just presented at Georgia State last week, and examples, but happy to share slides or talk if anyone wants. So to have a good implementation, you really need 2 things. You need 2 active ingredients. One is information, and 2 is the intervener. By information, I don't mean raw data. I mean information, data that's turned into a story, a narrative, something that they could chew on and act on. And then 2 is the intervener. Who is that person who's going to do something differently because they saw the data? If you don't have those 2 things, then you're doing a science experiment and you're playing around. So I'll give a couple examples. The intervener are instructional designers, and the information is detail on course pass rates. Instead of just looking at DFW rates of a course, which are pretty one-dimensional, we dug in and found that people fail or drop out of courses for different reasons. Some try and don't do well academically. Some don't even put the effort in. So we built a dashboard that lets instructional designers zoom into that DFW rate and understand the nuances behind it. Second thing, the intervener are success coaches, advisor coach folks here at ASU, and the information is LMS activity data on the students. So if a coach is about to talk to a student, they can go to a dashboard and see how much activity the students do in the LMS relative to everyone else in that class, the grade they're getting in the class, how they're doing on assignments, so that they are much more informed as coaches when they talk to that student. So it helps them be better coaches, advisors. So I have a couple other examples, but thinking about that, what's the information and who is the intervener, having that up front really helps these to be a little more successful.
Thank you so much, Mike. And I feel like you've spelled out a really great, this information plus intervener thing. I'm definitely going to steal that one. That's really helpful. I think that partly answers a question that we had from the audience, but I'm going to float it to other panelists and see. Casey wants to know, Casey Davis, how do we get educators read those well-versed in cognitive development, pedagogy, collaborating with data scientists in order to provide targeted intervention? It sounds like a great model, but how do we actually get them to collaborate in an effective manner? Tips and tricks. And audience, I should invite you also to add your thoughts in the chat. If you have responses to any of these questions, I know you're living the data life daily. Okay, moving on then.
Sam, I'll pop in here and say that there are people on a campus that have the skills to be interveners. And, one place to look is advisors that understand strength-based advising, consulting. The tough piece of the puzzle is taking that insight or that possible intervention and moving it into practice. What we're talking about is changing the institution, and there's the challenge I think that we are struggling with. We've got the data, and I think we have the skills to design interventions. Where is the responsibility and the leadership to actually to make that change? I think that's where we're going to be going next.
Yeah, what I've seen is that success begets more success. So don't try to conquer the world in one step. And I think the key is really understanding, hey, there are all these different opportunities. Which one should I prioritize first, given my resources, and do a good job with that particular population and show some success. And also highlight the relationship between how they changed processes and how those processes actually led to improved student success outcomes, both anecdotally as well as using quantifiable metrics. And I think it really starts from the top as well, but at the same time, in order for them to make the right decisions, you need to give them the right information in the right format that they understand and digest easily.
Thank you so much, Dave and Colleen, for that. Another audience question from Lorenzo at Zennial Digital. He'd love to learn more about how systems currently provide real-time actionability on the data. He notes it seems very people-driven, but with the amount of data available, how is this organized and delivered to the intervener by the system itself? That seems like it could be a Mike question, but also could be Tanya too. Any panelists, feel free to take it.
Hey, Sam.
Yes.
I think this might be a good place for that dashboard I was showing before. So I'm going to turn on my share for just a second. This is something that we've set up for faculty, which at WGU means both course instructors who are responsible for teaching the specific content, and a role we call program mentors, which is similar to advisors at other schools, except that they are assigned to one student, to that specific student for their entire program. And this is something that's at a student level. It's of course been like white outed, so you can't see the student. But this is something that updates every day and shows their activity and where they're doing things, the difference between the amount of time they're spending on a section and the amount of time their peers spend. So getting to be a darker red color, the more that they're spending more time than their peers. And then showing areas where it looks like they're struggling and the specific concepts that relates to. So this is one of the ways that we're trying to show those interveners some of that information, as Mike was saying, so that they can take the information and work out an intervention with the students.
Jenna, thank you so much for sharing that. This is excellent. I'd love to invite any other panelists to weigh in on Lorenzo's question.
Hey, Sam. Dave and I have been talking about this very question because WGU is way ahead of more traditional older campuses like R1s or public universities. And one thing we've been talking about is, and Tanya will address this much better in some ways, is sharing what we are finding as powerful predictors so that institutions can go in and look at those predictors themselves. Because, you know, when I look at our analytics engine, it had 100 powerful predictors, but that was based on the beauty of the data, the clarity of the data, not on who is struggling. So we had to do a lot of work to find out what the predictors were saying about our students in the present moment. But I think that there are a lot of campuses who struggle with the same student populations, the same issues as UW-Tacoma. And if we could share data and say, hey, look at this. Look at what happens when a young man under 21 takes one online course per semester or quarter. Their retention rises, according to their peers, more than 7%. Is that true for your institution? Because that's a very, you know, it's a very interesting thing that in some ways you say afterwards, well, babies need milk. Why didn't I think of looking at that? But it took us a year to look at that. So if we could share that kind of data with other institutions, we would find powerful predictors that we didn't know to look for.
Thank you, Colleen. I was definitely clapping on mute. that was fantastic. And in fact, we have about 7 minutes left in our program, and we've covered a lot of territory, but there's also some uncharted territory. So I'd like to invite each of the panelists to give their final word. This is your opportunity to maybe say something or cover something that has not been covered yet. We'll start with you, Tanya.
Oh, when you said that, I took a big sigh, like, oof, I wasn't ready for this. Actually, I really love what Colleen just said. You know, we're working with different things, SIS data and survey data gathered. We're trying to incorporate sharing of LMS data. But I think also, I think we have to remember, folks, that not only is every institution not a WGU institution, not every institution is even a University of Washington Tacoma institution. There are tons of post-secondary institutions across this country that are doing nothing around learning analytics and data science. They are doing nothing beyond their traditional institutional research supporting and maybe some one-off SOTL activities. So keep that in mind as well. You know, we're sort of a small pool yet here too. But I really love what Colleen was saying. I think we have a problem with the people who fund the research, and they're looking for these specific things instead of letting, like Colleen's idea about sharing in the underrepresented populations and their characteristics and the ones that we know that struggle and finding similarities. I know that UW-Tacoma is actually very similar in your makeup as University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And so again, I can't emphasize more how much we need to be collaborating and communicating and sharing and working together to advance post-secondary education in this realm. And I know we're all in our silos at our institutions trying to do it, but I think Colleen had a great idea, and I think a group of us could get together and find some funding and make that happen. So thanks.
I love this idea, and for those of you who are interested in this idea, there is a channel in the Shaping EDU Slack workspace called Data Driven. Let's continue the idea exchange and conversations there after this event. Would love to see you there. Thank you so much, Tanya, for joining us. Mike, final word.
My parting comment is start small. Once you get momentum going, it's amazing that, you know, success begets success. Don't try to do a big, giant predictive model. Just try to get a couple of data points out of the LMS. I mean, it doesn't take tons of staff. I mean, I've got grad students here at ASU. They're doing phenomenal things, like during internships. So just start small, do something, and then do a second project and a third project and a fourth project. Otherwise, it becomes this big daunting thing, and you have meetings and committees, and it gets much less productive. So absolutely, start small, get momentum.
Thank you so much, Mike. Over to you, Colleen.
Okay, so I think we have covered a lot of territory regarding the work that's ahead, regarding the work that's really already been done and that people can take advantage of, but the work that's ahead. And it would take a long summary for me to talk about all of the amazing things I think that we can do. So instead, I'm going to do a shameless plug for the new analytics handbook that I am author and co-editor of. I just put it in the chat window. But I want to talk about two things really quickly that we haven't talked about. And one that I want to sum up with is that even with our best intentions, I think there is a new profession that is arising, and we have to better define it. I talk about it in the book with all the failures I had of moving from insight to action, because our IR couldn't do it. Our advisor team really couldn't come up with big interventions because they're focused on the individual. So I think there's a role for the person who takes who turns evidence into insight and then advocates in the correct place in the institution for those actions. And the last piece I have, there is a wonderful chapter by an organizational development person, Rex Miller, on the shadow culture that will sabotage your best interventions because change is hard. You know, I have someone that says that change will happen only when the pain of change is less than the pain of staying the same. And I don't think that for higher education, the pain is high enough in our organizational structures and leadership. So, you know, my summary is bring on the pain.
There is beauty in pain and discovery in pain. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your wisdom, Colleen. Final words from you, Dave.
Oh, thanks, Samantha, and thanks, everyone. Great conversations. So I want to say just two things. One is we really need to transition from risk prediction to student success impact prediction. And I know easier said than done, but I think there is a way to get it done. And the second point is that we should never underestimate the power of students helping students, because I was talking to a researcher at Purdue University, and he did an experiment on writing nudges. And what he found was that the best nudges actually came from students. And I've seen that's the same evidence in the healthcare space in terms of you create a social network and then you try to, you know, influence patient behavior through these influencers. And they're also a lot more effective when we built the models. What we found was that 2 of the top 10 predictors were both writing nudges as an influencer and then receiving nudges that spark the conversations.
Thank you so much, Dave, for sharing. And I definitely going to give back a few amens with that last lot. Thank you so much. Jenna, last but not least, your final word.
Thank you. I think building off what Colleen and Tanya have said, and you know, moving forward, there's definitely some challenges and resistance around sharing data openly. But one of the things we can do right now as members of different institutions and teams is we can be sharing the insights we get from the data. We're not sharing specific student names or specific student outcomes, but we can start sharing things that work and trends that we're seeing and see how universal they are and what can be gained by looking at those in our own institutions.
Thank you so much, Jenna. Thank you so much again to all the panelists. Big round of applause. Yeah, way to go. And also to our incredible audience for keeping us on our toes with great comments, examples, questions. And thank you, Lara, for sharing an abundance of resources in the chat and everyone. The final thing I want to say here today is we hope to see you all July 17th. Mark your calendars For our next episode of Shaping EDU Live, it will be focused on building effective communities of practice around technology and education changemaking. In fact, I'm pleased to announce that beginning in July, our Shaping EDU Live series will be supported by a partnership between ASU Shaping EDU and Penn State, specifically the Penn State founded Co-Action Learning Lab. We'll be using the Co-Action Learning Lab's methodology of ensuring that all live events like this one lead to the collaborative creation of a free, openly licensed resource that's created based on the discussion from the event. So we hope you will join us for our 90-minute session. Note, it's changing to 90 minutes beginning July 17th. If you can't make all 90 minutes, we still want to see you anyways. Come for the first hour. Thank you so much. And also please note, once again, save the dates. March 11th through 13, 2020 is the next Shaping EDU Unconference. Yes, we will hopefully see each other face to face. Imagine that. More details will be circulated at the end of July. So until next time, keep dreaming, doing, and driving. Thank you, everyone.